You want to read this pearls versus turds?
Sure. Hi, Ben and Nathan. I'm a huge fan of the podcast and am currently taking your premium class on the demon. I noticed that you lowercased the demon. It's offensive. I'm just kidding, obviously. Okay, you've helped me so much throughout this process. Being someone who cannot afford to pay hundreds of dollars for LSAT preparation, the affordability of the demon has been a blessing. Sorry, I'm just laughing because someone was just saying it's like outrageously expensive, and
It's all
someone else is
relative.
saying
Yeah,
it's extraordinarily affordable.
it is relative.
Um,
Yep.
okay. This evening, I was struggling with the replace unless with if not rule. I figured out a much easier way to explain this to students. Simply negate the first part of the sentence that comes before unless and keep the second half as it is. It really is as simple as that. You can still keep the rule unless equals if not, because since if is the first part of the sentence, then in an if then clause, you can just not the if or negate the if. Okay.
Turd.
Uh
Instant turd. You want to hear my devastating argument?
Go for it.
What if the first word is unless?
Actually, I don't see a problem with that.
She said, simply negate the first part of the sentence that comes
Mm-hmm.
before unless.
Yes, you'd have to have everything after the comma in your sentence
Mm-hmm. Is that really an
be the
easier way? I mean, I'm I'm glad you understand it that way, Ariana. And we probably need to have multiple different ways of teaching it for people who don't catch on to one or the other way.
mm-hmm.
That said, this ain't how I'm teaching it. Um, I don't want people to have to rearrange the sentence first and then negate the part that comes before the unless and keep the other part the way it was. I don't. We can do it
Maybe
both ways, right?
let's tweak it. So basically every unless clause, every unless sentence, god damn it. Every unless sentence has two clauses, right? And if you negate whichever one comes first and leave the other one alone, and you make the first one your if clause, and you're fine. The problem is you have to make sure to make the first one your if clause.
It's super confusing to do it this way. I'm sorry. You know what the best way is to do it?
What's better? I mean, I think unless is just something that a lot of people struggle with. Like
Right.
sometimes they
I think that there are three phases of unless awareness. Okay. The first
no,
one is to
this isn't more complicated.
no, because the first one is to get the fuck out of your head and ignore all of this crazy technical bullshit and just realize that you use the word unless all the time in real life. And it's this is why I don't really like teaching a lot of the like keyword semantic related conditional
hmm
reasoning stuff,
hmm
is because you can figure out what the trigger on the rule is without any of this technical mumbo jumbo. I mean, listen, if I say unless it rains, California is fucked. Unless it rains, California is fucked.
hmm
Okay. Without all the technical language, what's the trigger on that rule? What's the event that is going to let us know that another event is going to happen?
If it doesn't rain.
Yeah. If it doesn't rain, we're fucked. So unless it rains, we're fucked means if it doesn't rain, we're fucked. And you don't need any of this unless equals if not. You don't need any of this negate the first part of the sentence that comes before unless and keep the second half as it is. Or people say that even in more complicated ways, right? People go, negate the first part and that's your sufficient condition, and then the second half is the necessary. And it's like, yeah, I know, but the trigger on that rule, the thing that's going to let us know another thing, is that if it doesn't rain, we're gonna, then I know for sure that we're gonna be fucked, because like you said, unless it rains, we're fucked. So the first stage of unless awareness is to just forget all of these fancy rules and all the fancy terminology and just think about what's the trigger. What's the thing that, if known, is going to let us know another thing? And we use this language in common sense all the time. You know,
So I'm gonna have to push back on your first rule of, what'd you call it? Unless
the
awareness.
first stage of unless awareness.
Yeah, the first stage of unless awareness. And the reason why I have to push back on this is that I I agree with you on that idea for so many things. I mean, that's kind of what the demon, I think, stands for, right?
Right.
Like, let's drop a lot of these technical
Yes.
hurdles and so forth.
Yes.
My concern about the word unless is that I feel like it's one of maybe two or three. I have to think about it, but at least with unless, I would feel like it might be an exception to the rule. And I think that's because, this is my theory, of course, this all falls under the speculation of the Thinking LSAT podcast, but I think that a lot of us were raised by parents who used unless incorrectly. So the example I give all the time is when someone says you can't go outside and play, or you can't leave the dinner table unless you eat your veggies. And then people mistakenly get the message that if they eat their veggies, they can then go outside.
Yeah.
And so then they have this like incorrect usage that's become natural for them.
That's fine. Okay, you can't go outside unless you eat your veggies.
Yeah.
What that means is if you don't eat your veggies, you can't go outside.
Yeah.
I have no problem. I didn't have to do any if not. I didn't have to do any negate the one thing and negate and whatever the other. My parents didn't go to college, and my parents do not use language accurately at all. I never had a problem with unless. The very first time I saw the LSAT, I never had any problem with unless. And that's why we have stage 2, Ben, and stage 3 of unless awareness.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Okay.
Continue.
Well, I mean, because you're right, Ben. Of course you're right. You're technically right. But boy, more than anything else, I don't want to give people the message that this shit is harder than it actually is. So like
Mhm.
I, my problem with 99% of all other LSAT prep is that they convince people that they have to be scared of shit that they probably understand with just intuitively.
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
so your example is a perfect one. You might, I would, and I think many other people would read the rule, you can't go outside unless you eat your veggies, and they would go immediately, oh, so if you don't eat your veggies, sorry, kid, you know? Or they
Yep.
would go, so if I see you outside, I know you ate your veggies. Those are
Mhm.
both correct ways of understanding the unless, and they don't have anything to do with any of these rules and semantics and all that shit. But if that doesn't do it for you, or if you want to double check, I think the
Mhm.
second stage of unless awareness is to just replace unless with if not. So you can't go outside unless you eat your veggies. The unless means if not. So if not eat veggies, then the other, whatever the rest of the sentence was, whether that came before or after, doesn't matter. Just replace unless with if not this
Mhm.
thing, that's the sufficient condition, then the other thing. And,
Cool.
and then and only then would I go into Ariana's whole, maybe I can upgrade this to a tie if we make it stage 3 of unless awareness. But I would prefer that people get there on phase 1 or phase 2. Are they phases or are they stages? I can't remember. Stages.
Stages. Sure. Yeah, I don't know. I I'm just more willing to help people into or out of I don't know how you want to talk about these lower stages, because I feel like unless tends to lead to like situations where people intuitively interpret it incorrectly and are extraordinarily confident in their answer.
I agree
And
with you
I would say that
1000%.
yeah.
But I agree with you 1000%. And yet, ain't nobody out there who scores 175 who actually spends time on phase 2 or phase 3 of this shit. It's just not a thing. The people who score really, really high are going to intuitively understand this, or at least eventually they're going to get themselves to the spot where they're going to intuitively understand it in the vast majority of circumstances.
Yeah, I think you're right actually about that. And I think that that's kind of what happened to me, cuz I feel like when I say unless sentences now and then I think about what they mean, it makes sense to me, right? It's
Right.
not just like, and even if it's weird shit, like I like making up random unless sentences in class because sometimes the LSAT's talking about subject matter that people are not familiar
Or
with.
completely abstract stuff.
Yeah, like it will rain unless it is not cold, and
Right,
people are
right.
like, "What?"
Yeah, right.
And it, so anyway, but I think by doing it and then confirming and being like, okay, yeah, that's the correct interpretation, it became intuitive
Yes.
even in the abstract context.
Yes. The
So,
last thing I want to convince people is that every time they see the word unless, they have to go through some complicated translation process. Now, if you've gotten burned before, like if you've missed actual real LSAT questions, then okay, there's something there that you're missing, and maybe you need to, in your review process, you need to go through a couple, examples and go through a couple different phases and or these stages, try out a couple different ways of understanding unless. That's fine. I mean, this is one of the most technical things we ever have to teach.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Even still, I would much prefer that people just attack the LSAT in a natural, intuitive sort of a way. When they miss a question, then they can get into all this semantic bullshit. But I do
mm-hmm.
not want to convince people that they have to do some complicated technical shit that they really don't have to do in the vast majority of circumstances. Like yes, there are going to be one or two questions where they're going to use it in a particularly tricky way. Fine. You don't need to worry about those really. Not until you miss them. Once you miss them,
Yeah.
then you need to worry about it. But you don't need to then have a thing like you're now super gun shy about every time you see the word unless you get out your fucking slide rule and start doing like complicated calculus on it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Well,
the demon brand in a nutshell, right? Is like, please don't overcomplicate this shit.
and I don't know, I agree with that. And I don't know if we're 100% on the same page and we're saying the same thing, but in my mind, I look at the test as let's teach this as all intuitive, and I
Unless
might
you
make
miss a question.
unless you miss a question. Um, the two exceptions I think I would make are unless and only if, where I might only if
Sure.
is even easier, but I would
Sure.
explain like the technical rule with the goal that eventually it would become intuitive. And so it's like you go back and forth between like what your intuitive understanding is, and then maybe you get a question wrong and you look at the technical interpretation of unless or only if, and then you're like, oh, and then you do that enough to the point where you don't have to verify it through a technical rule. But by that point you also could if you ever got nervous.
I think we're saying exactly the same thing. This is for sure the difference, though, between a practice based teaching approach and a theory
Mm-hmm,
based teaching approach. We are
mm-hmm.
firmly in the practice based camp. Do
Yeah.
questions, then review the ones you've missed, figure out in the certain cases where there is a bit of theory that you need to learn. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you can figure that shit out. Uh, when the other, I mean, I just think it's a more common sense way to do it. I think it's an easier,
Mm-hmm.
more fun way to do it. The complete other theory is, oh no, we're going to have you read a 300-page book of techniques and strategies and theories and we're going to warn you of all these pitfalls in advance,
Mhm.
then start doing real questions.
Yeah.
I can't, there's no way I could do that.
Yeah.
Not for me.
And a whole host of other like rules. So, um, anyway.
Yeah. Oh, just like, I mean, no, like people who have these like complicated technical primers that they want you to read before you start, it's just that it totally stifles people who could have scored 165 on their first practice test without doing any prep or any theory or anything.
Yeah.
I mean, because that's like ultimately my real message here, right? There are people, many of them, with no technical training, no formal logic training, nothing like that. But they just score 165 on their first test. Well, then how tricky and how technical can it possibly be if there are these people who intuitively do that well?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it
So,
reminds me of the company that shall not be named.
oh God, no, we cannot name them.
But they have that list of like 80 some odd flaws, right? And I remember some student showing it to me and saying, like, here's this list. What do you think of these flaws? And I'm like, honestly, I don't know what 2/3 of these are referring to. I could guess. I have a sense of what they might be referring to, but there is no way that I have any clue what they're saying. And when I work with students, like one on one, it's like, yeah, this is a correlation to causation flaw. You should know that one. I'm going to know that one by name. But they're like, well, what's this flaw? And I'm like, it's just a jump. The conclusion brought in some new idea. I don't have any other sort of name for that. You see how that's fucked up? And they're like, yes. And it's like,
Right.
that's the problem.
Exactly. Yeah. And you as a professional LSAT teacher who scored in the 99th percentile more than a decade ago, and this is your life's work, and you read that list of flaws and you're like, huh?
Yeah.
I don't know what these are. Well, okay. But can you imagine as a novice, you're like, oh, well, no, I can't take a practice test yet because I have to make
I'm
sure
not.
I
I'm only
read.
familiar with 30 of the 80 listed flaws, and there's got to
And
be more than that too.
it can't even possibly be an exhaustive list
Yeah.
because they could always come up with some other new bullshit argument and then have
Mm-hmm.
an answer that just describes the bullshit.
Yep.
They did this bullshit thing. There's infinite ways to bullshit, Ben. Trust me.
Yep.